On April 1st, 1979, President Jimmy Carter signed an executive order creating the Federal Emergency Management Agency, better known as FEMA.
When I was governor, I saw during several emergencies how important it was for governments to cooperate in crisis situations. And I want to be certain that this ability to work together is increasingly clear and unobstructed.
A few months later, Carter signed legislation creating the U.S. Department of Education.
Education does more than add to the skills of a labor force or to the gross national product. Its contribution is more basic than that. Education is a way that our society regenerates itself. In the words of Thomas Jefferson, it's the very engine of our democratic government.
Carter helped organize the federal government we know today.
Carter left a bigger imprint on the structure of the federal government than most recent presidents. And it's especially noteworthy because nobody remembers it.
But now, President Donald Trump has taken a hatchet to it. Among the changes he's pushed for, dismantling FEMA and the U.S. Department of Education.
On today's show, we'll look at Carter's mark on the federal government and how debates about these agencies when they were created helps us understand the fight over them today.
Plus, a look at bathroom parity at the state capitol.
I open the door and there's, everybody having a fun and conversation. I'm like, where's the ladies' room? Down the hall.
And whether Metro Atlanta's population growth is slowing. I'm WABE politics reporter Sam Gringlas.
I'm WABE politics reporter Rahul Bali, and this is Plugged In from WABE. Sam, so let's start in the present day where the Trump administration has moved to drastically cut the footprint of the federal government.
Right. So today we're going to focus on two parts of the government targeted for big cuts. President Trump signed an executive order in March to eliminate the U.S. Department of Education. But this effort was challenged in the courts, and the administration seems to acknowledge now they can't just shutter a cabinet-level department created by Congress. But still, Trump has moved to essentially defund and dismantle it as much as possible. With FEMA, Trump has said states should take more responsibility for disaster response, and his Homeland Security Secretary has kind of walked back his initial call to eliminate the agency, now just saying the president simply wants it remade.
Both the Department of Education and FEMA were created in the late 70s under President Carter. Sam, can you put their origins in some historical context?
Yeah, so let's begin this story when Carter was running for governor of Georgia. One of his biggest campaign pledges was to reorganize the Georgia state government.
It testified to Carter's deep interest in the actual functioning of government. This was more important to him, that government work for the people, than any particular ideology.
That's Jonathan Alter, author of the biography on Carter, His Very Best. And he told me that Carter's training as an engineer really influences his management of the state and then later the federal bureaucracy.
This was central to his whole approach, and sometimes it could be politically unpopular.
And so when Carter gets to the White House, he carries that with him. This is also the era post-Watergate when distrust in government is really high. And also the federal bureaucracy has really grown and is quite sprawling. Remember, you've had FDR's New Deal and LBJ's Great Society. And Carter sees a government that could use some reorganizing. He pushes civil service reforms through Congress and creates agencies like FEMA and the Departments of Education and Energy.
So let's begin with the Department of Education. How did that come about?
To answer this question, Rahul, I called up Marty West, a professor at Harvard University. He's written extensively about the history of the department. And he told me that when Carter was running for president, teachers' unions were amassing real political power for the first time.
He noticed that all of a sudden there was this new potential force in American politics, and that was the teachers' unions.
And so Carter made a campaign pledge to create a federal education department. And then he scored the National Education Association's first ever presidential endorsement. The department, though, didn't come together until 1979, ahead of the 1980 re-election campaign. One reason it took so long is that bureaucrats didn't want to give up the programs that were under their purview and give them to this new department. And even Carter, who had been a local school board member in Sumter County, Georgia, was not totally sold on this new federal department, but he did keep his promise.
Because of you today, there is a full-fledged, cabinet-level Department of Education. And a chair in the White House, not many yards from here, in the cabinet room, marked Secretary of Education.
Its status has been controversial from the jump. It's hard to overemphasize the depth of our nation's tradition of state and local control over public schools and the appeal that that has.
It's also no coincidence that those who argue that the solutions to our nation's problems are obvious, that our nation's challenges lend themselves to simple solutions and simplistic approaches, should be the same people who opposed the establishment of this new department. Most Americans know the value of education, not just in triggering economic and social progress, as important as they are, but in strengthening democracy and freedom.
When President Ronald Reagan took office, he tried to eliminate the Department of Education. And while George W. Bush really embraced the federal role, you might remember No Child Left Behind, small government conservatives have been really consistent critics of it. And that's only increased in this era of politically charged debates about education.
So let's now turn to FEMA.
The federal government has had some role in disaster response since the early 1800s, but the modern era of disaster response really began in the mid-20th century.
You had people building houses and businesses all over the country, but particularly in places that were pretty vulnerable to natural disasters.
That's according to Andrew Morris. He's a professor of history at Union College. And he told me that a few major disasters really spurred this rethinking about the federal role in disaster response, most notably Hurricane Camille in 1969. The storm devastated parts of Louisiana and Mississippi, and Morris says civil rights leaders were voicing concerns about Black victims being treated unfairly by the state response, and at the same time, elite businessmen wanted federal might to help speed the recovery.
So you have these kind of both forces helping push for this expanded set of federal programs.
And 10 years later, Carter brought many of the federal disaster programs under one agency, FEMA.
We want to bring together for the first time programs aimed at preventing and mitigating the effects of potential national disasters, such as floods and fire, with those designated to deal with these disasters once they occur. By consolidating emergency functions into a single agency, reporting directly to me, we will make our readiness programs more visible, and we can integrate these better with programs of the states and local governments, with private industry, and with volunteer organizations.
Over the years, FEMA's management has not always been praised, like after Hurricane Katrina, but support for federal disaster response broadly has not been really controversial. Unlike most social safety net programs, Morris says people see disaster victims as deserving, people dealing with an act of God like a hurricane, not their own choices.
So let's bring this back to now. Sam, how does this history help us understand the current moment that we're in?
I put this question to our historical guides. Here's one of West's takeaways.
Even when you come into office supporting the elimination of an agency, once you exercise control of that agency, it becomes tempting to also use it to advance your own goals.
West says, for example, we've seen the Trump administration use the Department of Education to withhold funding from colleges and universities, for example, to get them to comply with his policy priorities. And Morris notes we've seen FEMA slow-walking disaster aid in some cases to certain states, which he says is a real departure.
They might have political consequences, but the immediate response didn't tend to be explicitly partisan.
One other point here, departments created by Congress can't just be shut down, and there's still often broad support for individual programs, like funding for students with disabilities or recovery from hurricanes, fires, and floods. Now, to go back to Carter, Jonathan Alter says Carter did prioritize government efficiency and frugality and did pursue deregulation for things like the airlines or even the beer industry, but still,
It's just a difference of night and day. President Trump doesn't care about any of the details. Carter was immersed in the details. President Trump was using a wrecking ball. Jimmy Carter was using a scalpel.
You know, lots of presidents have tinkered with the shape of the executive branch, so I asked Alter what makes the Carter era stand out from the rest.
It was historic because of his attention to the functioning of the federal government and his insistence that it be honest and free of corruption. And this is a stark contrast to where we are today.
And you know, Rahul, we're not even 1 year into the Trump administration, and so we're going to continue to track President Trump's efforts to remake the federal government.
Sam, thanks so much for that history and context around the U.S. Department of Education along with FEMA. So let's take a break here. This is Plugged In from WABE. Welcome back to Plugged In from WABE.
Okay, so we've had some new entries into the 2026 field this week.
That's right. Governor Brian Kemp's preferred candidate for U.S. Senate, former University of Tennessee head football coach Derek Dooley, made his entry official. And we have another big name jumping into the race for Georgia governor. This time it's Democrat Michael Thurmond.
Lick Mike Thurmond, governor in 2026. Inflation, healthcare, crime, all that he'll fix. All these things he'll fix. Where the voters at? Where the voters at? Mike's hat is in the rain.
Okay, well, that definitely is the first original song I've heard of this campaign.
You know, Sam, it reminded me of the late Senator Johnny Isakson, who had a campaign ad with a song called Rock the Boat Johnny. You know, Thurmond's a longtime name in Georgia politics. He served as state labor commissioner from 1999 to 2011. More recently, he served as the elected CEO of DeKalb County from 2017 to the beginning of this year.
So you've got someone with deep experience in public administration and Georgia politics, but we're also in this moment when you hear a lot of Democrats calling for a new generation of leadership. Thurmond is 72 years old, and he was first elected to office in the 1980s.
And something else Thurmond is talking about is bridge building and working with the other political side, but that may be something that some Democrats are not interested in. We've both gone to Democratic events where you're hearing from advocates and activists saying they want a more aggressive approach toward President Donald Trump and Republicans in general. On WABE's Morning Edition, host Lisa Rayam asked Thurmond about the political climate in Georgia.
You can look at decisions being made, and quite frankly, it's becoming more aggravated in recent years, where rational, common sense thinking has been forced into the background. And now we play purely to an extreme basis of support. And oftentimes those issues don't negate or don't net a positive gain for the majority of the people of our state. Georgia is not the worst state, but we are underachieving. We've been fighting with one hand tied behind our back simply because roughly half, if not more, of the state has really not had a seat at the table.
Thurmond joins an increasingly crowded Democratic field that includes former Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, State Senator Jason Estevez, and State Representative Derek Jackson. Over on the Republican side, the leading names for governor are Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones and Attorney General Chris Carr. Let's stay at the state capitol, which is undergoing major renovations, and one of the goals is to add more bathrooms.
But Georgia's actually already ahead of the curve of other state capitals where female lawmakers are still fighting for bathroom parity between men and women. You know, one of WABE's editors came across an interesting article in the Associated Press last week that looks at this issue of potty parity in state legislatures around the country. And it included this little nugget about bathrooms being a part of the big Georgia Capitol renovation that's happening right now. And so it got me curious about the history.
Sam, so what did you learn?
The first two women were elected to the Georgia legislature in 1922, but when Kathy Steinberg took her seat in the Georgia House in 1977, she was still one of just a few women. And as she recounted later in an oral history with the Russell Library, it quickly became apparent that the 1889 building was built for men who had their own members-only restroom.
I open the door and there's, everybody having fun and conversation. I'm like, where's the ladies' room? Down the hall.
So Steinberg had a female news photographer take a photo of her and other female lawmakers waiting in line for the public restroom, along with school children and anti-equal rights amendment protesters. All were in this mix. And Steinberg kept pestering the House Speaker, Tom Murphy, who let Steinberg use his personal facilities until he finally agreed to add a toilet and a sink for the female lawmakers.
Well, that was the most important thing I did in about the course of 2 or 3 years. That was symbolic because I knew it was we were there to stay.
Democratic State Senator Sally Harrell remembers hearing those stories when she first took office in 1999.
I think they just wanted me to know that it hadn't always been so easy and that they had fought for that.
So bring us to what's going on today.
Now, the Capitol has gone through renovations since then, and this latest nearly $400 million reno will include adding women's restrooms on the 4th floor by the public galleries.
Getting to the bathroom is important because we only have 60 seconds to cast those votes.
So that AP article I mentioned, it quoted a University of Illinois architecture professor, Catherine Anthony, who has long promoted the importance of bathroom parity. And I was able to dig up some sound of her testifying on this issue to Congress back in 2010.
Much of our built environment was constructed in a different era, one where women were not as prevalent in the public realm as we are today. Forcing half the population to wait in line for restrooms is a subtle yet powerful form of gender discrimination.
Here in Georgia, Senator Harrell has helped win changing tables and places to breastfeed, and not just for lawmakers.
The state capitol is the people's house.
Harrell says one area where the Capitol could still improve, stocking restrooms with tampons.
So let's stay at the state capitol, where Georgia Republicans appear unlikely to pursue off-schedule redistricting, even as Republicans in Texas and in other states take steps to draw new maps to boost the party's chances of retaining control of Congress. Democratic lawmakers in Texas fled the state to Chicago in an attempt to prevent Republicans from passing the new map.
Congressional districts are redrawn every 10 years after the census, but the Trump administration has been pressuring states controlled by Republicans to draw new maps now ahead of the 2026 midterms. Texas unveiled maps last week that would eke out even more Republican-leaning seats, and now some Democratic states have threatened to follow suit. But several GOP sources in Georgia tell me there's little appetite for doing that here. One reason is that Republicans have already juiced as many Republican seats as they can out of Georgia, especially given Voting Rights Act litigation that forced Georgia to add another majority black district. And unless Governor Brian Kemp calls a special session, which he seems unlikely to do, there probably wouldn't be enough time to get new maps done early next year before the candidate qualifying deadline that happens in March.
On the topic of elections, you've also got an update on the drama over appointments to Fulton County's election board.
Yeah, a Superior Court judge says Fulton County commissioners have to sign off on two controversial Republican nominees for the local election board. The county Republican and Democratic parties each nominate 2 members to serve on the Fulton County election board. The Fulton County GOP put forward Julie Adams and Jason Frazier. In May, the commission's 4 Democrats declined to seat those 2 Republicans and asked for different Republican nominees. Adams is a current member of the election board who sued her own board for the right to vote against certifying election results. You might remember this. It sparked a showdown in court ahead of the 2024 election. Frazier has helped lead the effort to challenge the eligibility of thousands of voters, mostly unsuccessfully. Both have promoted false claims about widespread election fraud. But Fulton Superior Judge David Emerson ruled that the law says the commission shall seat the party's nominees, and nothing in the code allows for them to do otherwise. Now, this decision is expected to be appealed by the county, and it looks like the commission isn't going to take action on these 2 nominees until this litigation is resolved.
Okay, Sam, you wanted to talk now about population, specifically the population of Metro Atlanta and what it means for policymakers. Metro Atlanta is still growing, but the growth is slowing.
Right. Next week, we're going to get the latest population estimates from the Atlanta Regional Commission. The numbers aren't out yet, but we're expected to see the 11 county region's population growing in the year that ended April 2025. Last year, the numbers showed the city of Atlanta and exurban counties like Cherokee and Henry continuing to lead the growth, but overall, the region's growth rate has slowed down. And now this report is coming on the heels of a much-read Wall Street Journal article that was headlined, "Atlanta's Growth Streak Has Come to an End."
Yeah, we saw this being discussed all over my feeds.
Yeah, me too. And the report highlighted a year of census data ending in June 2024. So not the most up to date, but it suggested that slightly more people, just over 1,000, moved out of the metro than moved in for the first time in 3 decades.
We've been making population estimates since the 1950s at the Atlanta Regional Commission. And what we've learned in these many decades of doing that work is to not focus on a single year of change.
I spoke about this recently with Mike Alexander, the Atlanta Regional Commission's chief operating officer. When the commission first started making these estimates, Rahul, it was at a time when the Sunbelt's population was beginning to boom with the invention of air conditioning.
The best indicator of a region's growth potential for many years has been mean January temperature.
Now, those shifts continued into the 21st century as the region continued to draw jobs and transplants, but census data suggests the boom may be slowing in Metro Atlanta and similar regions, possibly as people opt for places with less traffic and more affordable housing. Alexander, though, thinks it's too early to draw any conclusions, but says continuing to model the region's population is really crucial.
We have to help our communities plan for that transportation infrastructure, understand what type of housing they're going to need, how much water demand will be generated by that population and employment growth.
And so, Rahul, when we get these updated numbers next week, it will give us some clues about Atlanta's future.
So that's it for this edition of Plugged In from WABE.
Plugged In is produced by Brendan Rivers. Our managing editor is Alex Helmick. And a special thanks to the Carter Presidential Library for the archival audio you heard in this episode.
Plugged In is available wherever you want to listen. If you listen on demand, make sure you head over to the Plugged In feed to subscribe and leave a rating.
You can also now find us on the radio at 90.1 every Friday morning from 9:30 to 10.
And remember, as public media faces an uncertain funding stream, you can support this work with a gift at wabe.org/donate. I'm WABE politics reporter Rahul Bali.
I'm WABE politics reporter Sam Gringlas. We'll be back next week.